I'm Max Keiser, and this is the Keiser Report. Let's twist again. Stacy Herbert.
We're doing the twist, Max. This is Operation Twist. I'm going to show you what Operation Twist is, okay? I'm Ben Bernanke. Hi, I'm Ben Bernanke. I've got a pig. I've got a monkey. I got some chopsticks, some twigs, and a dice.
Oh, yeah.
This is apparently Operation Twist, Max.
Tell us more.
Headline reads, Fed's Operation Twist fails to reinsure investors. Max, somehow all this stuff did not impress investors.
Well, the Fed is failing. Ben Bernanke is failing at his job in providing price stability and wage stability in America. And he's trying to turn, as you point out, junk into something that will provide collateral for a banking system that's collapsing. And the market is saying, we recognize that you're a fool, Ben Bernanke, and we're crashing.
Well, this quote comes from Alan Blinder, a professor at Princeton University, and he's a former vice chairman of the Fed. And he said, through Operation Twist, Bernanke is throwing sticks and stones and pea shooters and BB guns and whatever he's got at the weak economy in the effort to make marginal improvements. I don't expect any miracles from it, and frankly, neither do they. So, Max, we see this often. We see this junk shot over and over in the last, 2 or 3 years as the whole financial system collapses, but as all of our systems collapse. We saw the junk shot in the Gulf of Mexico with BP. We saw the junk shot in Fukushima.
Yes, the junk bonds have been replaced with actual junk from the junkyard. And the problem is this Operation Twist, which for viewers who may be joining us late, this is an attempt by the Fed to force down long-term interest rates by selling the short-term paper. Usually it's the other way around. So that's why they give it this name, Twist. Why? Because interest rates are zero already, so they're digging deep into their bag of tricks to try to keep rates at zero. And of course, rates at zero, zero interest rate policy, or ZIRP, is the cause of the problem. So the very fact that Bernanke is trying to exacerbate the problem, throw gasoline onto the fire of artificially low rates by figuring out ways to keep rates even lower, shows that either A, he's a moron, B, he's a tyrant, C, both.
Well, the Fed itself said on their website that the program should help lower costs for home loans, corporate bonds, and other consumer and business lending. The plan will provide additional stimulus to support the economic recovery, but the effect is difficult to estimate precisely.
Let me demonstrate the problem, Stacy Herbert. Here, take one of your props here, this red rubber ball.
That's not a prop, that's monetary policy.
Oh, okay. So I go to eBay and I put this on eBay and auction this off. I could get at most 20 cents for this on eBay. If Goldman Sachs takes this down to the Fed will give them $20 billion for the same item. That's the inherent problem with the American and global economy. The banks get privileges with these central banks where they can give them anything, whether it has value or not, and the Fed gives them trillions and trillions of easy credit.
So yes, we're in this position, and the next headline reads, Max, the Fed disappointed. The great collapse is here. This is from Phoenix Capital Research on their site, Gains, Pain, and Capital. So the Fed disappointed with this $400 billion QE light. It's not really QE3, it's Operation Twist. But the most striking thing, the thing that upset the markets and sent everything down a wild spiral, was that the Fed downgraded its view of the economy, stating that, quote, there are significant downside risks to the economic outlook. And so for some reason, the same guy with his pea shooters and BB guns and all sorts of junk as we have here, some reason that these people believed his now prognosis that it's all looking bad, as if the last 3 years, as we've been saying, it hasn't been all looking bad.
Well, this is the charlatan aspect that goes with Wall Street and the Fed. They're shamans. They're snake oil salesmen. They do a dance of deception, and the American people and the global community falls for it every single time. That's why the lottery business does so well, or the casino business does so well. There's a sucker born every minute. And Ben Bernanke is the circus master who's just hinting at great things to come while stealing people's money all the while.
Well, Phoenix Capital says that many people will lose everything in this mess. Yes, everything. The U.S. is going to be defaulting on its debt. Paper currencies around the world will fail. It's going to be a dark, dark time, Max.
Well, people are liquidating portfolios. Hedge funds are liquidating. Institutions are liquidating. They're selling everything to raise cash. And they're throwing gold and silver out as well during this liquidation. And this gives people who haven't participated yet in gold and silver a golden opportunity to load the boat with the only currency left standing when this shebang finally is over. The dollar, of course, is something that people are running to. But these are like the people on the shore of the Indian Ocean, running into the tide as the tide pulls back, not knowing that behind that is a tsunami of fiat money, in this case, that is going to swamp them.
Well, let's turn to the original Dr. Doom, with his doomy prognosis here, and his thoughts on gold.
I'm not selling my gold because I think in the long run, they will print money. As soon as markets in the world are down another 10, 20%, even the Republicans will write a letter to the Fed, you have to ease. You understand? Now they can sit back and say, don't ease, we have done enough. But as soon as asset prices go down and the economy is weak, everybody will again applaud the Fed if they print money.
Right. Well, Mark Faber, world-class macro analyst, the only PhD in the economic space that I trust, and he's got a track record of performance to back it up. And he makes the same point I just made, but in a really interesting accent.
But what about what he's saying? Because isn't this the case that this is how our economies have been hijacked? The markets fall 10 or 20%. Everything's, and everybody calls their congressman and says, do whatever it takes. Get Ben Bernanke to do whatever it takes to save the bankers and therefore save me and my 401k.
Well, it goes back to 1987 and the crash of 87, when Reagan, Robert Rubin, and Alan Greenspan, then chairman of the Federal Reserve, got together and they started to buy the stock market, the S&P futures, on the day after the famous crash of 87. And this was the beginning of the Working Group on Markets, or the Plunge Protection Team, as it's called. And from then until now, that fund, that slush fund that the government uses to fix prices, has grown exponentially. It's now in the hundreds of trillions of dollars, and most of it's in the shadow banking system. And the result is no more legitimate price discovery. All prices and all exchanges are now manufactured. And they manufacture these prices largely for the effect of propaganda. This is financial propaganda. It's a new epoch in the history of propaganda, and it's conducted principally in the United States.
Max, actually, I have another prop in this pile of junk on my table, and that's this junk dollar.
Yeah.
And I noticed one thing here. It has the pyramid, of course. Everybody knows about the pyramid on the back. Well, that's in my next headline.
Oh, okay.
BMW town crashes in pyramid fraud. Yes, Ben Bernanke's pyramid fraud scheme isn't the only one going. For as long as anyone can remember, Shiji, a town in China, has been poor. The village is little more than a dusty grid of brick shacks, and its residents live on an average of just £1,000 a year. But this spring, a miraculous transformation occurred. Their locals suddenly noticed that they were rich. We have become a BMW town, declared one shocked villager in the local internet forum. Well, it turns out that it was a guy named King Claw, and he returned to the village from Beijing, and he had a fantastic idea. He took the villagers' savings, which amounted to $55 million, and he promised them interest rates of 10% on their savings. What he did with it is lent it out at 30% to property developers who built all these fantastic apartment developments which nobody could afford to buy. So the whole pyramid fraud collapsed.
King Claus rhymes with John Law. But
I didn't think
this is a classic example of a pyramid scheme, a Ponzi scheme. And of course, it involves real estate, which was the favored instrument of a Ponzi scheme favored by Alan Greenspan and Ben Bernanke when they artificially dropped interest rates after the 9/11 attacks. Remember, to prove to the world that America still had what it takes to be the biggest consumer and polluter in the world, they dropped rates down to 1%, and this unleashed this real estate bubble. People, of course, love the idea of buying real estate for no money down, and that created the final stage of the final blow-off of the final bubble that we are now living with the consequences today that will never, ever be paid back unless there's a global cooperation of a reconfiguration of the global currency grid. And until that happens, just expect this depression to get deeper.
Yeah, but Max, how is King Claw any different from Chairman Ben Bernanke? Because here's a guy who used this pyramid scheme in order to foster a housing bubble in this remote town. The same thing is happening in the US, and this is what Operation Twist is about. This is what all of this junk is for. Ben Bernanke wrote on the U.S. Federal Reserve website, he says it's in order to encourage more housing lending, mortgage lending. That's what he wants. How is it any different from King Claw?
It is no different. You're absolutely correct, Stacy Herbert. The number one concern of Ben Bernanke is to get the housing market reinflated. And he's doing this by trying to expand the base of the pyramid scheme. And what he's finding is that there are no more suckers. They fail to admit that they've reached the end of the line for this particular chapter in the American Pax Americana pyramid nightmare. And the world will continue to suffer until there's a massive boycott of U.S. Treasury bonds and the U.S. dollar, which we're seeing right now in the price of gold and silver.
And then at the heart of this, always, like the U.S. pyramid scheme and the Chinese pyramid scheme, at the heart of it lies a desire for German-made goods that nobody can actually really afford. Because here's the woman's quote, a quote on the website that I said, we have become a BMW town. In our county, there are now 800 BMWs and 600 Mercedes, 500 Audis, 50 Porsches, 30 Jaguars, and 1 Ferrari, 1 Lamborghini, and 1 Maserati.
Precision engineering.
But that's, again, everybody wants, with their fake pyramid schemes, to get real goods and services that only the Germans apparently are the only people making anything. Everybody's turning to Germany saying, please, you guys make stuff that we want. Please continue to accept our confetti, our junk, all our sticks and stones and BB guns for your goods.
Here's one arrow, the silver bullet of solution for American and global economy. Have Apple opened a car manufacturing plant in Detroit, manufactured by Americans. Thank you, Stacy Herbert, so much for being on the Keiser Report.
You're welcome, Max.
Don't go away. Much more coming your way. Don't even go to your flight. It's been canceled. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. I've got him. He's here. Joe Wiesenthal, welcome to the Keiser Report. Oh,
thanks for having me on.
It's fantastic that you're here in the studio. I want to jump right to actually our last question from a tweeter who wants to know, do you ever sleep?
And the answer is, unfortunately, I do. I try not to, but I have to a few hours a day.
Okay.
I try as hard as I can not to.
If you could, you'd like to be tweeting or commenting 24/7.
Ideally, that would be an ideal situation.
Okay, fantastic. So Joe Wiesenthal, we just heard from Alan Blinder. He's the former Fed chairman. He talking about Operation Twist.
Right.
And he's saying, if you think of sticks, plastic pigs, twigs, BB guns, for monetary policy, he's making fun of the whole thing, saying the collateral is worthless.
Right.
Your thoughts?
I mean, I actually think technically he's right in the sense that I think Operation Twist isn't really going to do anything for anyone. The impact will be pretty minimal, and the idea that lowering interest rates is going to have a big impact at this point when they're already at record lows is, kind of a joke.
Right.
So it's a superficial thing, and there's this expectation of the Fed to act when things aren't going well. So that's kind of like, I guess, a signal that the Fed isn't totally out to lunch, but in terms of it, I would be very surprised if it had a real positive impact.
Well, let's talk about that for a second and follow up on that point, because you said that the expectation that the Fed can do something is kind of running out. Now we go back historically to the Greenspan put. During the whole 1980s, anytime markets were faltering,
Right.
Alan Greenspan would lower interest rates. Suddenly markets would catch a bid, trade higher. Bernanke inherited that legacy. But it seems as though the Fed's ability to stimulate these markets is finished, is over. Is that kind of what you're alluding to?
It kind of seems like that. I mean, especially, look, certainly the markets reacted positively to QE2 and QE1. And it's probably too early to say a verdict yet on Operation Twist. But even Bernanke himself seems to be kind of skeptical. He gave a speech a few weeks ago in which he was basically saying if we're going to do anything, it needs to be fiscal policy, spend more, basically trying to kick it back over to Congress. So I think even he doubts that at this point monetary policy is a great tool. But it's still possible that the Fed could juice the stock market if that's all he was going for.
Now, your role over there at BusinessInsider.com, you're the deputy editor,
Right.
correct?
Yeah.
Now, Business Insider is primarily focused on, if maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a big emphasis on technology.
Well, it's kind of half and half. There's like a tech side, and then there's like the finance-y kind of
Okay,
side.
there's a huge tech component.
Yeah.
And the tech component we know in the States, it begins in the venture capital area. It goes through financing rounds.
Sure.
Then we end up on NASDAQ with an IPO, hopefully.
Yeah.
And this is the exit strategy for the VC investors, the venture capital investors. Okay, I wanted to ask you specifically about one company and get your thoughts on it, because there's a big debate out there. Groupon.
Right.
Okay, it's pre-IPO. They turned down a $6 billion offer from Google. They are attempting to go public at a $20, $30 billion valuation. There's one school of thought that is looking at Groupon, and the words Ponzi scheme have been mentioned.
Yeah.
Is this fair or unfair?
The most interesting argument is that the original investors have taken a lot of money out of the company already. They've already made tons of it, and so the company's never been profitable. And yet you have early players, including the CEO, who have already not totally cashed out or anything, but have taken a lot of cash out. And so now they're still cash hungry, but it's not a Ponzi scheme unless there's no business there, and there is a business there. And they're making more and more money from their existing customers. They have excellent customer loyalty. Growth is still crazy. Businesses generally still like it, though there are issues and lots of competition. So it's not a Ponzi scheme because there is a real business.
Well, I think what people are pointing to when they mention Ponzi scheme is the fact that the lack of really the repeat customers. In other words, they make a big splash.
It's not that bad. Actually, they make their repeat customers aren't that bad. But that is the big controversy. The question is, do they need to just keep adding customers in order to make the numbers look
That's
good?
right. That would be the definition.
If they were to shut down customer acquisition right now,
Yeah.
and just with the customers that they have, would they be able to have a business? And there is an argument that they would, actually. It's not clear that they have to keep spending like crazy. But that is certainly their plan, and their plan is to raise a lot of money from the IPO.
And without that IPO money, is the company still with us a year from now?
It would be very dicey. They're burning through a lot of money.
Okay, fair enough. Let's talk about French banks for a second.
Sure.
Morgan Stanley, hugely exposed to French banks. Is it too big to fail? Can U.S. banks survive a French banking collapse? What are the cross currents there?
I would say Morgan Stanley is too big to fail, in the sense that if it were to have a failure like Lehman, and I don't think it's going to, or I'd be surprised if it did, it would certainly have huge ramifications on the financial system. There is this talk that it's exposed to French banks. That might be overblown in the sense that, all kinds of banks have huge notional exposures to various things where, in fact, when you look at hedges and what the actual risk is, it's a lot less. I don't know. I haven't dug too much into Morgan Stanley, but I do know that it's the fear of the stock has really been getting hammered this week. And stepping back from Morgan Stanley, it's hard to imagine a situation in which, if you had failures of the big French banks, BNP Paribas and Société Générale and the rest of them, it's hard to imagine the U.S. financial system not really getting hurt by that. I mean,
Right, this word contagion is what comes up. All the banks are connected on the back end. Now, Gordon Brown, former Prime Minister of UK, referred to formally in the record of the shadow banking system.
Right.
There's widespread understanding that there's this the dark pools, the shadow banking system, multi-trillion-dollar kind of back channels connecting all these banks, where a lot of this debt is off balance sheet, so to speak. And the idea is that Bernanke is trying to shovel cash in the front door while the back room, the off-balance sheet accounts are blowing up, and he can't seem to match the two. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I mean, I think the easiest way to think about it is that everyone wants cash, right? Or, you know, in times like these, when people are, people get nervous or things are actually going bust as they are in Greece, everyone just wants cash.
Okay, but Joe, isn't the role of the Federal Reserve Bank, historically, it says the job to take the punch bowl away when the party gets too good. Now, for 20 years, for 10 years, they haven't taken that punch bowl away. They keep throwing more, they keep spiking it with more cheap money. At what point do they get responsible? Obama was talking to Volcker when he came into office, but he never did anything.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that, well, the times haven't been good in a while, in any real sense. I mean, the last couple of years have been okay for the economy, but certainly, I mean, when they talk about taking the punch bowl away, what that would have meant is, like, prior to the housing crisis, the Fed should probably have been more proactive to see that there was too much bad lending going on, because that's essentially what that means. It essentially means the Fed needs to step in when there's too much credit creation, inflation. But we really haven't been like that in a while, and we certainly haven't been like anywhere near too much lending since the crisis hit. It's not a solution to just keep rates low forever. It's certainly not going to fix the economy, but it has kept the financial system alive, which is, I would argue, pretty important.
Isn't there a case to be made that, as you point out, the credit has been in short supply during this crisis, but in due large part not to an economic slowdown necessarily or a business cycle trough, but to outright bank fraud? Isn't there a case to be made that maybe someone needs to step in and bring some justice to what are obviously some criminal activities going on in these too big to fail banks?
I think there's two different things. I think the reason that there isn't much lending is because private sector households have too much legacy debt, and their main goal at this point is not to take on more of it, but it's to pay down the old debts that they rang up. There may be a role for more prosecutions of the people who are involved in the bubble and the bust.
When you say
possible.
Hold on, Joe. When you say the private sector is taking on too much debt, and then you hear Jamie Dimon or JP Morgan saying that, Basel III agreement is inconvenient for us. We don't really want to comply to minimum capital requirements. We just want to put on as much debt as we possibly can. Just thumbing his nose at the whole idea of regulation, the whole idea of sound banking. I mean, who's going to stop and put the tourniquet on this guy? He's a rogue banker. He makes Jerome Kerviel seem like Mother Teresa, Jamie Dimon.
I actually think... I'll just skip that.
You can't just skip that.
I'm just going to skip that. But
that's not an option.
No,
you can't just skip. Because you're a journalist here representing the interest of the industry, and I'm making a serious charge here. One of the chief guys in your business is a flagrant lawbreaker per the Basel III Accord. Why is he in jail?
He's not a flagrant lawbreaker. He's made an argument in a newspaper that a certain aspect of the regulation favored European banks over American banks. He's never made the argument that you're trying to say he made, which is that he doesn't believe in capital requirements or regulation. He actually made a pretty specific claim that the way Basel III treated this one kind of asset fundamentally disadvantaged American banks. And that's all he said. So comparing him to a rogue trader, I think, is a little dramatic. But on this point of credit, I think a key thing that people need to realize is that there's household debt, and there's the supply side on the banks, and there's government debt. And people talk about them as though they're all the same, and then they just say the word, there's too much debt. But specifically, I think the problem is not that there's too much government debt, at least in the U.S., but that there's too much household debt, and that's the bottleneck for the whole economy.
All right, we've got about a minute left. I want to go to Facebook questions. One from Jason E. Bishop. He asks, To Joe Wiesenthal, what possible reasons are there for investors to be buying U.S. bonds? And when the U.S. is the one with all the debt, what kind of investors are they?
The U.S. has a fantastic track record of always paying back its debt. And at times like this, when people are panicking, there isn't, you look there at things that have incredible histories of preserving your money and are liquid, which is, I think, why people are dumping gold right now and they're panicking, not because people worry about liquidity right now. They want cash. They want the most liquid. They're not worried about the U.S. dollar depreciating. That's kind of like a secondary concern at times like these. They just want the most liquid, stable assets they can
So it's
buy.
not Stockholm Syndrome?
I don't believe so.
Okay, let me go to the next question. Carl H. Tattooist asks, why did he, Joe Wiesenthal, a few months ago, still say that the bad economy is exaggerated? Does he live in the real world or in a computer world?
I live in a computer world. I live in a total bubble, and I live in New York where the economy is pretty good, and I don't see how the real world is.
Joe Wiesenthal, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thanks for having me.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Joe Wiesenthal. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.